Today, we're chatting with Lina AbuJamra about fractured faith. Lina, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today about your new book.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we talk about the topic of rebuilding, what are some of the reasons that led you to look at the topic of a broken, fractured faith that needs to be reconstructed?
I was broken. You know, it's funny. Most of the books that people write tend to have some autobiographical information, but I think that the thing of it is, I don't think I realized how broken I was. It was a few years after I left my church that the truth of what had happened had settled in. I mean, I knew all along that the decision to leave a church I was a very integral part of. I was already, felt called to ministry, felt that this was my church family, had really prioritized church life in my life. And as a Christian, I think you put that importance of the community. And when I decided to leave, it was for very God-centered reasons. There was no personal thing that I had done. It was just a leadership problem. And so in leaving, I felt like God would honor that leaving. And I felt like God would sort of vindicate, those who had seen some of the problems and would do something about it. And I think it took a few years the first couple of years were hard. I mean, I lost everything at the time that I had felt like meant something in my life. And I still don't know that I fully understood how much I had created a barrier in my relationship with God, so that what I had thought God would do in my life wasn't happening. And it was in that aftermath that I saw the level of destruction, of brokenness that had happened to my faith and my soul. And I think it was, again, a few years later, even as I started thinking about writing about the experience, that God started picking up the pieces. And even now, I think back about that experience, which I think has become so common in our culture. This, you hear about people who have become ex-evangelical or who have left the Christian faith. Deconstructed is, I think, the word of the day now. And so I think many people think they're okay. They're walking in the church doors. They're showing up to small group. I was teaching a Bible study. I was getting asked to speak. I was on Moody Radio. And yet inside there was this doubt and there was this deconstruction that was happening through my faith and my firm belief in God. And it was only when I started to address it that I realized the extent of the illusion I had about what God should do in my life, as opposed to who he really was and meant to be in my life. And so it was a big about faith that I had to come to. So
Is there fundamentally a wrong focus when our faith can be fractured by outside sources, peers, the actions of others, even our own failings? Are we somehow focusing on the wrong thing and then that causes some of this fracturing?
Yeah, sometimes you think about the chicken or the egg. At the end of the day, I'm an ER doctor. I think a person either has a problem or doesn't. And whatever caused it, now you've got a situation where you've got a crisis. And I think a lot of people don't notice there's a problem until it hits crisis mode. And I think a lot of things sound good to us intellectually. I mean, I could teach about anything, but it's when your heart gets engaged. And this is the difference between, someone who is a Christian because they were born in a Christian home in a Christian country versus someone who's embraced the Christian faith, that relationship with Christ. And I think there's a heart understanding in the core of your being. And I think with that, yes, there comes expectation. And some of it, I don't even think the expectation is always necessarily wrong. I talk a lot in my book about desire and expectation and longing. And I think those are God-given. But yes, how we want it to play out is based on so much of what culture teaches us we need. And I think God is so convinced that he is the answer to our longing, that he'll go to great extent to allow us to face disappointment in order to come to the place, or even sometimes people get what they want and they kind of go, man, this isn't what has made me happy. And then you're able to kind of go, man, there's something still missing in my life. And so it's when I've hit rock bottom in my life that I've been able to kind of look up and understand that ever faithful, what we call God's grace. I think God's grace sounds great when you have a pretty good life, but when you really start flirting with doubt and with, I talk a lot about how we respond to doubt. So many of us numb that pain, that doubt, that disillusionment. Many of us act out with escapist behavior, however that comes about. And I think there's, we think, man, if I get this, if I do that, things will get better, or we just ignore it. And it's only as we get to the heart of the matter that God can finally get to the depth of our pain, that God can show up and say, hey man, what you've wanted all along, it's right here. And if you're willing, man, it's yours for the taking. And that's really the story of fractured faith. It's the story of finding God in the midst of your pain.
How do we ensure that our faith is more solid based on the right things in the process of rebuilding?
Well, a lot of people haven't really. I mean, you hear about this all the time. People who grew up in the church who sort of have ended up deconstructing. They've left the Christian faith. They are a semblance of what they said they would be, and they look on people who are still in the faith with sort of disdain and sort of like you're not understanding as much. With there's sort of a sense of self, evolving, of understanding. And I really think I have the schematic in the book where I really think when you're going through a deconstruction, really it's going to come out of one of two ways. And I towards the middle of the book, I talk about what the normal Christian life is. And I think if you're a Christian, a true follower of Jesus Christ, nothing is going to separate you from the love of God eventually, not your doubts, not your failures, not your sense of disappointment or disillusionment or rejection, but sometimes it takes that road. And I think that road ends up being a blessing in the sense that you really get this tested and true faith man. But Peter went through it. I mean, Peter almost quit. He went to fishing after he did the thing that he thought he'd never do. And yet a few days later, he led the greatest revival that led us to the modern day church that we know of right now. And so I think the story of the Bible is a story of people who were hurt and broken and confused and disillusioned. And in the midst of their pain, God showed up, and the outcome was just beauty from ashes. And that's, again, the story of what I write about today. I don't have perfect faith, but I'm solid in the faith. How did that happen? Well, it's by walking through this valley of the shadow of death and this dark night of the soul. It's been described that way, and realizing that in the midst of that darkness, there was this little light of Christ still peeking through the door. And when it got a hold of my heart, man, it changed everything again. And I know it won't be the last time that I'll question some things in my faith, but God, by God's grace, he'll still be there. I want to say I'll never question again, but the truth is we might, but God will still be there. And it's his love. That verse that says, when we are faithless, he remains faithful, is so true. And it's only when you live that cycle over and over again that you really understand the depth of what God means when he says that he's faithful still.
Well, Lina, thank you so much for taking time to tell us a little bit about the book.
Thank you for having me again.